buenas tardes o buenos días, dependiendo de la hora local donde estén. Para aquellos que requieran traducción, for those who need translation, tengan en cuenta que hay traducción simultánea en vivo disponible para nuestro público. There's live simultaneous translation available for our viewing audience. Hay un pequeño icono que parece un globo terráqueo que debiera estar aquí en la parte de abajo de nuestra pantalla, que debiera darle acceso a la traducción. There's a little globe-shaped icon that says interpretation at the bottom of the screen, which will give you access to live simultaneous translation if you need it. Some of our speakers will be speaking today in English, others will be speaking in Spanish. So please note that we do have translation available. And with that, my name is David Shirk. I am the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego. I study Latin America, Mexico, the US-Mexico border, but with a special emphasis on rule of law and security in the region. I direct a project that's now reaching its 20th year on issues of justice in Mexico. It's called Justice in Mexico. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel discussion on the security situation in Central America. Over the past decade, as we've seen Mexican migration going into decline, there's been increasing attention to the phenomenon of Central American migration. Economic stagnation, natural and ecological disasters, widespread crime and violence, and democratic backsliding in the region have pushed hundreds of thousands, millions actually, of Central Americans to seek refuge and a better life in the United States. In particular, the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are among the lowest ranking countries by GDP in the Americas, with 30% of the population living in poverty in El Salvador, roughly 60% in Guatemala and Honduras, not to mention each of these three countries having some of the world's highest homicide rates, 50 homicides per 100,000 in El Salvador, 40 in Honduras, 22 in Guatemala. And in recent years, half of all pending US immigration cases have come from Guatemala with 21%, El Salvador with 18%, Honduras with 16%, compared to less than 20% of US immigration cases coming from Mexico today. So today there are roughly 4 million Central Americans living in the United States, over 80% of them coming from these three Northern Triangle countries. At the same time, there's been a growing backlash against immigrants and asylum seekers in recent years. Even as the US economy was growing, unemployment was falling, and violent crime was on the decline before the 2019 COVID pandemic-geddon. And during the Trump administration, despite these trends, we saw the number of approvals for US immigration and citizenship decline significantly. And until yesterday, the US government relied on a set of policies known as the Migration Protection Protocols, a legacy of the Trump administration that required Central American immigrants, Central Americans who were seeking asylum to remain in Mexico for months, often under dangerous and unhealthy conditions, before they even had a chance to present their request for protection to US Customs and Border agents. Understanding the situation in Central America is essential as a matter of US foreign policy and in relation to the upcoming US immigration reform proposals that are pending under the administration of Joe Biden. And with an eye to Vice President Kamala Harris's upcoming visit to the region on June 6th and 7th, the Institute of the Americas here in sunny La Jolla, California, has organized today's panel to help understand what is going on in the region and what lies ahead in the upcoming policy discussions. I want to recognize and thank IOA President Richard Kai and the team at the Institute of the Americas for the invitation to moderate today's discussion, as well as the panel of experts that's joining us today to discuss the situation in Central America. Specifically, we're joined today by 4 distinguished experts on Central America and U.S. foreign policy in the region. You can see their full biographies in the Whova application. Whova is also where we're going to direct any questions or comments for today's panelists, so please be sure to sign on to Whova. We'll be providing that information in the various correspondences about today's event, so please take a look for that. But I want to jump right in and introduce our panelists. Just please remember there is live simultaneous translation. Hay traducción simultánea para los que nos acaban de acompañar con el icono del globo que está a la parte de abajo de su pantalla de Zoom. I want to just introduce, first of all, our first speaker, Eric Olson, and I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and then we'll get started with the discussion. Eric Olson is the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at the Seattle International Foundation, where he provides strategic policy advice to the Foundation's Central American partners on priority issues such as promoting rule of law and good governance, ending forced migration and displacement, ensuring equity, and strengthening civil society. In addition to his work with the Seattle International Foundation, Mr. Olson is a Wilson Center Global Fellow. He served as the Mexico Institute and Latin America Program's Deputy Director for 11 years. He's published numerous articles and books, but especially for today's discussion, I want to recommend that you check out his recent publication on crime and violence in the Northern Triangle, how U.S. policy is helping, hurting, and can be improved. We're also joined today by our Arnau Baulenas Bardia, who is the legal coordinator for the Instituto de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad Centroamericana, José Simeón Cañas, which is based in El Salvador, in San Salvador, where he lives and works, and is reporting to us today live. Dr. Baulenas Bardia is a recognized legal scholar and a regional expert on issues of human rights and criminal justice in El Salvador and Central America's Northern Triangle region. He's a published author of various studies, including recently Human Rights in the Face of Gang Violence, which was published by the University of Notre Dame. We're also joined today by Adriana Beltrán, who is the head of the Citizen Security Program for the Washington Office on Latin America, or WOLA, as it's known, a US-based research and advocacy organization. Ms. Beltrán promotes policies that identify and address the root causes of violence and improve the effectiveness and accountability of police and judicial systems. She's written and co-authored various reports and articles on police reform, organized crime, and violence in Latin America, including Protect and Serve, the status of police reform and hidden powers. And she's currently leading a project to monitor efforts to address the root causes of migration for children and families from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Last but not least, we're also joined by Alan Bersin, who's currently a policy consultant at Covington and Burling. He formerly served as Assistant Secretary in the Office of Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He is the former Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and served in those capacities between 2012 and 2017. He's also served as Chief Diplomatic Officer for the Department of Homeland Security, leading the department's international engagement and serving as the principal advisor to the Secretary on all international affairs and functions. helping to develop the agency's policies and plans, facilitating multilateral, regional, and bilateral negotiations with foreign governments, including in Central America, and also served as the department's interlocutor with the Department of State and the foreign affairs community. He has served previously as well as the vice president of Interpol for the Americas. This is really an outstanding group of experts. We could not pull together a more informed or experienced group of experts on the region and today's topic. So we will begin today first with Mr. Olson looking at the region and particularly the case of Honduras. That will be followed by Mr. Baulenas, who's going to talk to us about El Salvador, Ms. Beltrán on Guatemala, and Mr. Bersin on U.S. foreign policy in the region. I do want to say two final logistical notes. For those who would like to watch or share this session for later viewing, please note that the video recording will be made available through the Institute of the Americas, so just check out their website for more information. And finally, I just want to remind everyone about the availability of live simultaneous translation. We'll give each of the panelists about 10 minutes to kick things off, and then we'll move into discussion and questions from the audience, which I will facilitate as moderator. So please, just one final note. Les quiero avisar nuevamente de la traducción simultánea que está disponible con el icono a la parte de abajo de su pantalla de Zoom. Y sin más demora, quisiera presentar a Eric Olson. I'm going to, without any further delay, introduce our first panelist, Eric Olson. Eric, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much, David. And I wanted to express my gratitude to Richard Key and Tania Miranda for the invitation. Thank you all for this, putting together this panel. I think it's wonderful that we have a chance to discuss these issues with such a distinguished group of experts. Many of you are friends of many years, not to say old friends, but I'm glad to also meet Arnau, and I've had a great deal of respect for the UCA's work in El Salvador, and so I'm glad that you can join us and bring us some perspective from El Salvador, where things are really quite challenging. Let's use that diplomatic word for the moment. As David suggested, I'm going to talk a little bit about Honduras, but I want to start by putting it in a bit of a broader framework around U.S. policy, and then give some specific examples out of Honduras for what I have to say. First, let me start by saying the U.S. has been treating Central America as a series of crises, problems, threats, and natural and human disasters for decades. This is true not only of Republican administrations, but Democratic administrations as well. We've sought to address specific problems from problems like confronting communism during the Cold War, protecting human rights and promoting justice, disrupting illicit drug trafficking, and also to encourage more economic growth, better job creation, to address the chronic poverty in the region. Major natural disasters, including earthquakes, hurricanes, and severe drought have also been a common occurrence in the region, costing tens of thousands of lives and billions in damage to infrastructure and shelter, just to name a couple. All these factors have contributed to the region's instability and soaring violence, which in turn has compelled Central Americans to seek refuge elsewhere, but primarily in the United States. The US has sought to respond generously to all of these challenges, but in most cases, our good intentions are not matched with expected and intended outcomes. We've spent billions in these countries, but they remain weak, poor, violent, and with high incidence of poverty and inequality. So the question is, why have our programs and assistance not been more successful? Why are the these still unsafe and insecure countries? Why are they still a major pathway to drug trafficking to the United States and a source of a major migration? In 2020, just last year, seems like ages ago now, I conducted a review of U.S. assistance programs to the Northern Triangle between 2014 and 2015 with my colleague Ricardo Zuniga and a team of excellent consultants. We worked out of the Wilson Center for this endeavor. Ricardo was on leave from the Department of State at the time and at the Wilson Center, but he's now back at the State Department and was named by the Secretary of State as the special envoy for the Northern Triangle. Our hope in our review of this period, our hope was to review this period, which was characterized by two surges in Central American migrants, especially unaccompanied minors in 2014 and 2015, and another surge later on that involved mostly family units and mothers with many young children. Some of what we concluded in our review were the following. The U.S. has lacked a clear long-term strategy for encouraging and strengthening democratic governance in the region. It has tried short-term approaches with dramatic shifts in aid levels that undermine the process of building a democratic state. We've frozen aid at times, as was happened in 2019. We had large sums of aid after Hurricane Mitch, and other times it was sort of a forgotten area of the world as the U.S. moved on to other priority issues. The U.S. has failed to grasp the primacy of tackling the governance challenges in the region throughout these efforts. Corruption, lack of independent prosecutors or independent judiciary, as well as co-opted oversight mechanisms like legislatures and controllers' offices, have not only undermined democracy, the rule of law, and security, but have decimated healthcare system, wrecked education systems, and skewed economic development in ways that exacerbate inequality and undermine potential long-term sustainable growth. Corruption has rendered ineffective public security institutions and law enforcement agencies, including the police, military police, and the military itself. Let me just give you a few examples of what I'm talking about from Honduras, a country which I've studied since the mid-1980s. Two separate independent civil society organizations conducted public audits of the government's response to COVID-19 and found significant examples of overpaying, price gouging for emergency medical supplies, PPE, and abuse of single source contracting. The most troubling finding from both organizations, both conducted separately, was that the government of Honduras prepaid for 7 mobile hospitals, several of which arrived much after the promised date, and some that never arrived at all. Even those that were delivered did not meet the needs of an overwhelmed healthcare system, and in some cases have never been installed. They sit in boxes, unopened, and not in use. Our own review of the Honduran National Police and police purge process in 2018 found that nearly a third of the force had to be removed for suspected corruption, abuse, or because they did not meet basic qualifications to serve as police in Honduras. 5 of the 6 top generals on the force either resigned or were dismissed for abuse of power or corruption. In 2019, a good friend and scholar, Daniel Sabet, wrote a case study on Honduras while he was a fellow at the Wilson Center. His case study is titled When Corruption Funds the Political System. Sabet explores and describes 4 types of corruption in Honduras. Embezzlement of social development funds, procurement corruption, organized crime corruption, and patronage abuses in the bureaucracy. To quote from the study, while each is distinct, in all four cases, corrupt proceeds helped fund political campaigns, making corruption a core input to the political system. And let's not forget the biggest and most obvious case involving the current president's brother, Tony Hernandez, who was found guilty of drug trafficking in the Southern District of New York. And in that and other subsequent cases, the US prosecutor referred to President Juan Orlando Hernandez as an unindicted co-conspirator in efforts to import drugs to the United States. So one of the big conclusions of our 2020 book with Zuniga is that success in Central America can be elusive because chronic and systemic corruption that has skewed the functioning state is not taken into account adequately. Furthermore, efforts to attack this problem have been systematically opposed by political and economic elites unwilling to sacrifice their privilege in exchange for stronger rule of law, greater accountability, and ultimately a more stable state able to provide security and conditions for prosperity desperately needed by its people. Many US-funded programs fail because they are not dealing with this central issue. We provide training, technical assistance, and equipment to individuals that are themselves powerless to overcome the system of corruption that permeates the state. We support legal reforms, but mechanisms of accountability for those who violate the law are non-existent. In Honduras, the national legislature, already under investigation for widespread corruption, passed a new penal code that lowered sentences for corruption and created a lengthy appeals process outside the justice system that in the end allowed corrupt officials to simply repay what they had stolen, and they did not lose their jobs or their position. So this is a dire picture, and I think we could feel hopeless about it. And in fact, I think many in Honduras and many migrants from Honduras, as we've interviewed them, do point to an overall sense of hopelessness about the future of their country as an underlying factor for migration. I wrote about this earlier this year in an article with my wife for Florida International University called Hopelessness and Corruption, the Unidentified or Overlooked Drivers of Migration from Central America. I think this feeling of overwhelming incapacity of the state, the inability of the state to meet the basic needs of people, including safety, security, and well-being, is really what permeates so many of the decisions of Hondurans to migrate. But let me not just end with that kind of maybe depressing and over negative approach. Let me offer just a few suggestions here at the end for a different approach to building security and democracy in Central America. First, it's obvious that we need a long-term, maybe 15, maybe 20-year approach to the region that puts democratic governance, rule of law, and accountability mechanisms at the center. Other issues like poverty reduction, job creation, and healthcare are all important. I'm not minimizing them, but all are made worse by chronic corruption and state capture. Healthcare in Honduras has largely collapsed, overwhelmed by COVID, but also because over the last 5-6 years, the healthcare system itself has been bankrupted by corruption. Secondly, the issue to be debated is not whether we should have more foreign aid or less foreign aid. It's not a debate about an amount, but whether that aid is contributing to building democratic governance. Third, to tackle the problems of corruption and a captured state, the US must pursue a very sophisticated and multidimensional strategy. First, it should support those reformers within government, especially within the justice system, that have demonstrated political independence. They need protection, technical advice, and political cover. There are very few, but it's, we should not forget there are specific people in the justice system in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador still attempting to do the right thing, and we need to be supportive of them. Second, we should support those outside actors, independent press, civil society, and those few in the private sector that have demonstrated a commitment to building the rule of law and increasing accountability. These independent actors have become the targets of government vilification, threats, death, judicial harassment, incarceration, and frivolous audits. Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are actively undermining the independent media and civil society because they are increasingly the only voice able to speak out against corruption and to attempt to hold people accountable. Third, we need to construct a strategy that includes both carrots and sticks. Aid can be used to incentivize some important reforms and advances, but it should be carefully calibrated, not just generally sent. Aid to corrupt governments where impunity reigns should be minimized and redirected to independent civil society, like happened recently, just this last week in El Salvador, when USAID reprogrammed money from a questionable justice system to support civil society. Sanctions are also useful tools when they are targeted and tied to bringing about specific change. Strong sanctions against Honduran legislators and politicians linked to corruption and impunity would send an important and significant message. Finally, we need to work with other donors, other international donors, to ensure a common front and strategy to isolate corrupt officials and promote democratic governance. If we focus our efforts in these directions, I'm convinced that not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but over the long haul, we can envision a Central America and a Honduras that are more stable, more prosperous, probably never wealthy, but certainly a place where people feel the government is listening to them, responding to their needs, and not the narrow self-interest of a corrupt elite of the country. So with that, I conclude and turn it back to David.
Thank you so much, Eric. We'll next turn to Arnau Baulenas Bardia, again, who is the legal coordinator for the Instituto de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad Centroamericana, José Simeón Cañas, in San Salvador, to talk a bit about the situation in El Salvador. And I'll just remind viewers that we do have live simultaneous translation available. I believe that Arnau is going to speak to us in Spanish. So for those who require translation, please see the little globe button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Arnau, adelante.
Muchas gracias, David, y muchas gracias por esta invitación, poder compartir panel con tan distinguidos panelistas, ¿verdad? Para mí es un honor poder compartir un poco la visión de lo que está ocurriendo en El Salvador. Y si hablamos de El Salvador, creo que hay un antes y un después del 1 de mayo del año 2021, ¿verdad? El 1 de mayo del año 2021 hubo un golpe al orden constitucional y, por tanto, podemos decir que probablemente hemos pasado a una autocracia, es decir, donde se acaba haciendo, se acaba fallando única y exclusivamente lo que es el deseo y la voluntad del presidente de la República, del presidente Nayib Bukele. Si bien es cierto que en el 1 de junio del año 2019 el presidente Bukele asumió el poder, un poder legítimo, fruto de unas elecciones, asumió la presidencia y por tanto tuvo el control del poder ejecutivo. En febrero del año 2021 teníamos las elecciones al poder legislativo y estas fueron ganadas por parte del partido oficialista con una mayoría amplia, una mayoría cómoda, pero sabemos que en un Estado social, democrático, de derecho, hay un tercer poder, ¿verdad? Que es el poder judicial, ¿no? Y esto era algo que efectivamente el presidente Bukele no podía controlar, porque esto es la gracia de la democracia, ¿verdad? Esto es vivir en un Estado de derecho donde hay pesos y contrapesos, ¿no? Por tanto, como el presidente Bukele no podía controlar el poder judicial, aquel órgano del Estado encargado, ¿no?, de controlar la legalidad de las actuaciones, ¿no?, de los funcionarios públicos, decidió de forma ilegal, de forma ilegítima, ¿no?, irrumpiendo el orden constitucional, decidió destituir el fiscal general y nombrar un fiscal general, entendemos, a su conveniencia con un proceso absolutamente ilegal, y decidió también destituir a los 5 magistrados de la Sala de lo Constitucional, que fue la sala quien estuvo controlando sus decisiones durante la pandemia, entre algunas, ¿verdad?, todas aquellas decisiones que podían significar corrupción, ¿no?, o que podían beneficiar de tratos oscuros por miembros del gobierno, ¿no? Como no estaba contento con esta decisión, como la Sala de lo Constitucional podía ser un freno en su deseo de gobernar sin contrapesos, en su deseo de poder gobernar única y exclusivamente con la obediencia de los otros, pues se procedieron estas destituciones y nuevos nombramientos que efectivamente constituyeron, desde nuestro punto de vista, una alteración a lo que se conoce como el orden constitucional y, por tanto, un ataque directo a la democracia. Y la pregunta que nos tenemos que formular es ¿por qué el presidente Bukele necesitaba hacer esto? ¿Cuál era el impedimento? Sí, aparentemente pues contaba con el apoyo de la población, ¿verdad? Porque tenía 80%. Pues mire, yo creo que podemos destacar 5 puntos fundamentales. El primero es porque no cree en la transparencia, es un gobierno corrupto y por tanto no poder tener el control del órgano judicial es que el órgano judicial le podía estar exigiendo transparencia o que el órgano judicial, iniciando a través de la figura del fiscal general, podrían haber iniciado acciones o investigaciones penales por los actos de corrupción múltiples que hubieron durante el manejo de los fondos de la pandemia, ¿verdad? Hay evidencia suficiente, evidencia de periódicos independientes, alguno muy reconocido como puede ser El Faro, donde indica que efectivamente el gobierno, funcionarios del gobierno se enriquecieron con los fondos que se manejaron durante la pandemia porque no había un control atendiendo a la urgencia de poder disponer de estos fondos y por tanto pues si el presidente Bukele no podía controlar el poder judicial, podían iniciarse acciones en contra, ¿no?, de sus funcionarios. No sabemos si alguna incluso podía llegar hasta el propio presidente, ¿no?, o personas muy cercanas a ellos, o empresarios del grupo muy cercanos, ¿no?, que se prestaron a actividades de corrupción. Por tanto, necesitaba tener este control, necesitaba hacer esta ruptura del orden constitucional para eliminar cualquier forma de transparencia y para tapar su propia corrupción. Incluso hace unas semanas la Asamblea Legislativa, a petición, digamos, del Ejecutivo, lo que hizo es aprobar una ley donde está prohibido investigar ninguna de las compras que se hicieron durante la pandemia, ¿verdad? Está prohibido investigar cualquier acto de supuesta corrupción que pudo suceder durante la pandemia. Esto es algo que acaba de aprobar hace 2 semanas la Asamblea, controlada por el partido oficialista Nuevas Ideas. Un segundo punto de por qué esto lo necesitaba el presidente Bukele. Lo necesitaba efectivamente para que nadie le controlara la legalidad de sus decisiones, ¿verdad? Es decir, para poder gobernar sin ningún contrapeso. Un tercer elemento que no es menor era para poner miedo a las personas, ¿sí? Cuando se ve que se toman estas decisiones el primer día que la Asamblea Legislativa asume el poder, lo que podemos ver es que efectivamente hay un miedo entre los defensores de derechos humanos, entre los periodistas que no son cómodos al oficialismo porque narran las cosas como son, ¿verdad? Y que por tanto molestan, y también a los jueces, La gran mayoría de los jueces, ¿no? La pregunta, la duda que tenía es si han hecho esto con el fiscal general, si han hecho esto contra los 5 magistrados de la Sala de lo Constitucional, ¿verdad? Que están en la cúspide, ¿no? De la Corte Suprema. ¿Qué podrán hacer con nosotros, jueces de carrera, de instancia, cuando tengamos algún caso que pueda tener interés, ¿no? El gobierno? Y hay un último punto que creo que también es importante. Este poder absoluto, sin ningún tipo de control, permite coartar la libertad de expresión, la libertad de información, perseguir a medios de comunicación bajo la figura de auditorías fiscales, bajo la figura de ciertas herramientas que se tiene del Estado, pero se desvían las finalidades, ¿no? Yo tengo una facultad legal, pero desvío los fines con el fin de poder propiamente lograr mi objetivo, y también ya se empieza a ver una persecución a los defensores de derechos humanos y también a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, ¿verdad? Donde todas aquellas que no son afines, todas aquellas que no, que critican o señalan actitudes por parte del oficialismo son señaladas, son investigadas, son estigmatizadas por parte del poder, ¿no? Y por tanto estamos en una situación crítica donde el escenario no es alentador. Desde un punto de vista de la migración, lo que podemos ver es que siempre han habido unos índices preocupantes de migración, ¿verdad? Por la situación de violencia que ha vivido el país, pero consideramos que esta situación de inestabilidad, esta situación de poder únicamente en una persona va a hacer aumentar la migración hacia el norte. ¿Por qué? Porque también va a tener un punto de vista laboral. Es decir, no consideramos que las empresas no invertirán en El Salvador. Incluso muchas empresas tendrán que cerrar por la propia persecución del oficialismo. Significará que se estarán perdiendo puestos de trabajo y, consecuentemente, aumentaremos la pobreza. Y ante estas necesidades, la gente lo que tendrá que hacer es salir en búsqueda de otras oportunidades, ¿verdad? Otro de los puntos, desde un punto de vista económico, es el nivel de endeudamiento. Como se tiene que justificar bajo políticas populistas, con políticas extremadamente asistencialistas, lo que ocurre es que hay un nivel de endeudamiento muy alto. No nos explican cómo se va a poder pagar esto, nos mienten con las cifras que están dando, y por tanto, pues esto también va a ser un impacto que vamos a tener a corto plazo. Termino también señalando el problema que vamos a tener desde un punto de vista de seguridad pública. Es decir, si bien es cierto, desde que el presidente Bukele asumió el poder, han bajado la cifra de homicidios, nadie sabe por qué. Nadie sabe por qué. Es decir, aparentemente, y han habido publicaciones también del Faro que señala que hay un pacto con las pandillas, entre el gobierno y las pandillas, ¿verdad? Pero claro, si este pacto fuera genuino en pro de la población, podría entenderse, pero al final no es más que un pacto para que ellos se puedan perpetuar en el gobierno, ¿no? Y ya sabemos cómo terminan estos pactos mal habidos, ¿no? Tenemos un problema también, que se han elevado las desapariciones forzadas. Esto es una situación grave. Y finalmente, la violencia feminicida, la violencia contra la mujer sigue aumentando y no es una preocupación real por parte del gobierno. De hecho, desde que el presidente Bukele asumió su presidencia, según datos de la Fiscalía, han habido 332 feminicidios. Esto también es una de las pandemias que tenemos en nuestro país. Aunado a ello, se está militarizando la seguridad pública, es decir, el presidente todo lo hace acuerpado de los militares como algo de fuerza, de decir, bueno, si ustedes van en contra mía, aquí tienen la respuesta, ¿verdad? Vemos que se pasean tanquetas militares por las calles de San Salvador sin ningún tipo de temor ni de pudor, y también hemos podido advertir de que el pasado corrupto de muchas personas, incluso las vinculadas al narcotráfico, vuelven a estar muy cercanas al gobierno del presidente Bukele y vuelven a estar muy cercanas al órgano judicial, incluso a la Fiscalía General de la República. Esto preocupa mucho. Termino en los últimos 30 segundos, un minuto, para cumplir con el tiempo, ¿no? Pensando o haciendo una reflexión conjunta de la importancia también de la posición de la comunidad internacional en esta situación que se está viviendo en El Salvador. Hemos vivido esta situación, lo que está haciendo ahora el presidente Bukele no es nuevo en Centroamérica, no es nuevo en Latinoamérica, parece que se está siguiendo un manual, y creo que es bien importante que desde la comunidad internacional no se blanqueen ninguna de estas acciones que se hacen por parte del mandatario, por parte del gobierno, ¿no? Porque si no, al final lo que vemos es que él aprovecha estas circunstancias. Creo que la decisión que tomó Said de reorientar los fondos que se iban a dirigir a la Fiscalía, al órgano judicial, a la Policía Nacional Civil, son buenos mensajes. Comparto también con el doctor Olson, ¿no? Cuando hablaba de otro tipo de medidas. Creo que hoy antes también la congresista Norma Torres hablaba de algún tipo de sanciones económicas para aquellos, ¿no? Que irrumpieron el orden constitucional. Pero creo que El Salvador en estos momentos está viviendo momentos trascendentales y se tiene que tomar una decisión importante, conjunta y unánime, y sobre todo apoyando a la sociedad civil, apoyando a los medios de comunicación independientes y apoyando, por supuesto, a los defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos. Yo me quedaría hasta aquí, muy agradecido.
Muchas gracias, Arnau. Una excelente exposición. Fantastic summary of the situation in El Salvador, particularly the policies and democratic backsliding we've seen under populist President Nayib Bukele, who has presented a frontal assault on the country's judicial sector institutions, in particular, his move in May to dismiss the newly appointed Attorney General and all 5 judges in the Constitutional Court, contributing to what many have called a constitutional crisis in El Salvador. Amid rampant violence, the growing wave of femicides, and ongoing concerns about corruption and the militarization of the government's response to these problems. We turn now to Adriana Beltrán. As a reminder, Adriana is the head of the Citizen Security Program for the Washington Office on Latin America, or WOLA. And I'll welcome and thank Adriana for her remarks.
Hi, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you to the Institute of the Americas, to Richard Kai and Tania Miranda for the invitation to be here. I guess this afternoon for me, morning for others on the opposite coast. It's really a pleasure to be here with old colleagues, colleagues Arnau and colleagues from DEIDUCA, Alain, David, and Eric. I'm going to focus on Guatemala. As has been said, there are many challenges related to the high rates of poverty, continuing high rates of violence, and of course the impact of the pandemic, natural disasters, and climate change, which have worsened conditions and contribute to the irregular migration from Guatemala. I will focus, however, on the issue of rule of law and governance, because I believe that is one of the biggest challenges that Guatemala is facing right now, and will be one of the biggest challenges that the administration will have to confront in the country in its efforts to improve conditions there. As Eric already mentioned and very eloquently described, one of the main impediments of economic development and improved security in the region and in Guatemala are the challenges related to systemic corruption and weak democratic governance. As has been said, this impacts every aspect of daily life in Guatemala and has hindered the ability of the Guatemalan state to meet people's basic needs. The efforts to bring about structural reforms in the country have failed, I would say, in large part, and this was also a conclusion of the report that Eric and Ricardo worked on, is in large part due to the resistance of a network of very powerful members of the political and economic elites that, in the case of Guatemala, I would say, have increasingly colluded with organized crime to prevent reforms from moving forward. These groups have exercised control through government institutions, through taking control of the judiciary to protect their interests, to ensure impunity for the crimes and maintain control of the economies. I would say that the system of corruption, of systemic corruption and impunity, was challenged, though, with the efforts of the CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, a UN-led body that was created to help Guatemalan authorities investigate and dismantle these illicit networks that had entrenched themselves in the state apparatus. through the work of the CC, we did see a process of strengthening the work of the public prosecutor's office, the creation of high-risk courts, improvements in the police, as well as several legislative reforms that were aimed at fighting impunity and criminality. And for many Guatemalans, the events, particularly of 2015, that led to the arrest of the then president, Otto Perez Molina, and his vice president, and many members of his cabinet, and those cases that followed represented the first step toward profound change in the rules of the game in the country. However, as we have seen, as the structures saw their power threatened, they began to push very hard. There was a big backlash with a strategy, I would say, not only of dismantling the progress that had been made and these impunity, anti-impunity initiatives, but of regaining control of law space. And this has included not only the closure of the CICIG in 2019, but it has included the re-cooptation of the justice system, not only in terms of trying to exert influence over the designation of the Attorney General, but it has included efforts to gain control of the courts. The election of the Supreme and Appellate Court, for instance, has been delayed by more than 2 years due to the Guatemalan Congress's refusal to comply with a court ruling that laid out the process for confirming the new magistrates in response to an investigation that uncovered how candidates, members of Congress, and outside brokers led by a businessman and a former politician who was recently sanctioned by the US Department of Treasury were colluding and paying bribes to influence the makeup of the courts. So now the judges that continue to have seats on the bench were the judges that were in fact picked by an under-the-table agreement between Molina's Patriot Party and the Leader Party, which for many that may not recall, the head of that party was convicted in the US on money laundering charges. This cooptation of the justice system has culminated with the recent election of the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the country. Now, I would say that, in recent years, it has been the Constitutional Court which has played a pivotal role in protecting the rule of law in the country and trying to serve as a check and balance to the efforts of these illicit structures to dismantle the anti-corruption efforts. You saw how the Congress swore magistrates who have been accused of corruption, who have engaged in organized crime, and who have clear conflicts of interest, and refused to seat an anti-corruption judge who had won re-election for another term. This has also included the control of the legislature, where you have, I believe, based on investigations, over 100 members of the current Congress, that includes the leadership as well, with ties to organized crime or who have been subject of investigations for their participation in corruption. That has signified that they have passed laws, again, similar to what has happened in Honduras, to protect legislatures and politicians and others from being investigated, but also to reverse many of the gains that had been achieved. This has also included or involved attacks against judges, prosecutors, and civil society through hate speech, but you've seen an increase of defamation campaigns on social media, and through criminalization or the malicious use of the legal system to promote unfunded criminal proceedings or arbitrary arrest of those that have led the fight against corruption. In a study that one of our partners carried out, they found that in 2019, for example, they saw an increase of more than 40% of cases of crimes committed against members of the justice system compared to the previous years. And between 2015 and 2018, there were 57 administrative complaints, 33 criminal complaints, and 22 requests to lift the immunity of the high-impact judges. So these are judges that were part of high-risk courts that were created with the support of CICIG to try cases related to organized crime, corruption, and gross human rights violations. And 50% of those complaints were made against 3 judges. So it really highlights the severe extent to which, specific judges that have been at the forefront of the fight against corruption have been targeted. The case of the Special Prosecutorial Unit that was established to work with CC as of October of last year had 47 malicious lawsuits filed against him. And the magistrate of the Constitutional Court that I just mentioned that was not able to be sworn in, at one point had 7 complaints that had been filed against her. Attacks have also included or targeted civil society organizations and journalists. Between January and December of last year alone, a local organization registered over 1,000 cases of attacks against human rights defenders. This was surpassed the figures that they had registered for 2014, which was considered the most violent year for human rights defenders in the country. And this is very worrisome if you take into account that one of the first actions that was taken by the new Constitutional Court was a decision to overturn an earlier ruling that provisionally stopped a controversial law targeting NGOs from going into effect. This new law imposes new executive controls on the day-to-day financial and administrative activities of NGOs, including control over internationally provided funds. And the new law essentially gives the government the ability to shut down an organization that disturbs public order. And the law doesn't really define what that means. So essentially, it gives the ability of the Ministry of the Interior to go after an organization that organizes a protest, that mobilizes communities, which is very common in the country, or to shut down organizations that are monitoring or accompanying those protests. And the NGOs that are shut down or their leaders can face civil or criminal charges. I'm not going to go into detail of the law, but just to say, we've seen these efforts and implementation of similar laws in other countries to silence critics. Now, given the time that I have left, I just want to, underscore some of the points that Eric made with regards to U.S. policy and the Biden administration. And one is that I agree with Eric that the focus needs to be on governance, on strengthening the rule of law and really addressing this problem of corruption. Because as long as this illicit groups, these powerful groups, are able to protect and profit from the status quo and continue building and strengthening a system of impunity, they're going to continue shaping conditions in the country and in the region. As Eric mentioned, the need for a long-term approach, and I agree with him. We need to stop perceiving the region every time there is a crisis and then turning our attention elsewhere. The challenges in the region are deep, and that is going to require a long-term approach and a focus on really trying to build the country and the region that these societies deserve. Third is that, the strategy cannot be more of the same, meaning that we can't go back to where the Obama administration have left things off. As I said, the challenges right now, the situation and the conditions in Guatemala and in the region have worsened, and we need to take this into account moving forward. And that's going to require, short, medium, and long-term unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral strategies focused on how do you debilitate the influence of these structures, the resilience of these structures. How do you protect and bolster those initiatives that are working so that we can strengthen them in order to create a more conducive environment for advancing these structural reforms? And as Eric mentioned, it's picking the right partners. As he said, there are people within the government, initiatives that are working that we need to support, that we need to bolster, and reformers outside of government that, again, are under continuous attack, working in very difficult circumstances that we need to support. And lastly, just to say, as Eric mentioned, that is just not a question of aid. Assistance is, of course, important, but I would say that diplomatic efforts are probably more important right now, given that, a lot of the change that is required in the region is an issue of political will more than technical assistance. And that means that, the United States diplomatic efforts, both private and publicly, need to work hand in hand with our aid efforts. And that means making good and strategic use of the carrots and sticks and all the tools that the US has at its disposal. And with that, I will end.
Thank you so much, Adriana. That was a really useful summary of the situation in Guatemala. As we talked about a little bit with El Salvador and Honduras, we've seen democratic institutions under assault in Guatemala from 2007 to 2019. The UN-led body known as CICIG, as well as various legislative reforms that Adriana mentioned, were part of an important effort to combat the system of entrenched corruption that undermined democratic institutions or continues to undermine democratic institutions in Guatemala, and even brought about the arrest of former President Otto Perez Molina, as well as dozens of other current and former government officials. But the real challenge looking forward is how U.S. Policy in the region, and specifically in Guatemala, can reinvigorate those efforts since the CICIG's closure in 2019, and it does seem that there's a consistent theme across our presentations suggesting that we need to do more to bolster civil society in the region. So I'm very interested to hear the remarks from our final panelist, Alan Bersin, who's going to talk to us about U.S. foreign policy in the region, the challenges confronting the Biden administration as Kamala Harris makes our first major diplomatic overture to Central America. And with no further ado, I'll ask Alan to join us. We'll then take some of the comments and questions we have in the Whova platform before we round out our discussion. So please take a look at the Whova platform if you would like to squeeze in a question before we end our session. Alan, take it away.
Thank you, David. And let me take this opportunity, as my colleagues did, to thank Richard Kai and the Institute of the Americas for organizing this panel on the eve of Vice President Harris's important trip to the region. What a depressing inventory regarding the status of the situation in each of the Northern Triangle countries, starting with Eric's cold review of the challenges in Honduras, followed by Dr. Baulenas Bardia's description of a autocracy taking shape in El Salvador, and Adriana Beltrán's discussion of Guatemala and its decline and movement away from the hopeful signs that began at the end of the Obama administration in the 2015-2016 period. What I'd like to do is, having participated deeply and broadly in the effort of the Obama administration, is to review the bidding, so to speak, because many of the same players and key players who were involved in that era and administration are now in power and shaping the policy toward the Northern Triangle. Let me start by saying I agree completely with Adriana and her conclusion that we cannot see a continuation in the Biden administration of more of the same. But frankly, that's what we should expect, because we are dealing with problems that are intractable in many ways in terms of short-term and even mid-term solutions. And now that I'm out of government and have reflected on the efforts made during the Obama administration, I'd like to share some of those conclusions. And I say that with great respect and admiration for the people who are back in power, certainly preferable to the people who took a entirely different approach to the Northern Triangle, one that was distasteful, disdainful, and completely uninterested in conditions in the country. And I must say that in Ricardo Zuniga and Juan Gonzalez, we have among the finest public servants we could have. So my comments should not be taken any more than looking very coldly and realistically, from my perspective, at a series of deep and enduring problems in the region. Many of them have been taken up. The first is actually the United States has to come to grips with what is it trying to accomplish. Most of the effort to shape policy in the Northern Triangle, at least as it's articulated domestically, is around how do we deal with eliminating the push factors out of Central America that create problems at America's southwest border and in the transit zone up through Mexico. We have to come to grips with, are we there because we're trying to solve a US problem? Or are we there because we actually are trying to deal with deep problems that have regional significance? And in a world that is moving past the post-World War II order to a multipolar, competitive international order, we have to understand where does the Northern Triangle and Central America as a whole fit into what is emerging rapidly in terms of a changed global geopolitical situation. We have to come to grips with what are we trying to accomplish. I think it's fair to say that the criticisms that Adriana and Eric have leveled are fair. Our policy is short-term and it's incremental, and it's basically geared to programs that are not likely able to take on the basic problems in the society. These are political societies that are basically controlled by a handful of families. And I say that not in an effort to denigrate the efforts in those countries, indeed the heroic efforts to institute a democracy more akin to what takes place in the European Union, or at least traditionally in the United States, than has been the case in those countries. But the fact of the matter is we're dealing with governments that are, frankly, must be confronted as, if not entirely caught up in webs of corruption, then at least substantially and materially compromised by corruption that make it impossible to talk about creating the kinds of rule of law that, in fact, Adriana outlined and Eric indicated. Look, in fact, at the situation that Dr. Baulenas Bardia outlined in El Salvador. You have a democratic election producing a new leader who then proceeds to institute autocracy. And having having seen the United States gone through the issues of the Castroite revolution in Cuba in the 60s and indeed up until today, and the Sandinistas' betrayal of its original ideals and statements of purpose, you have to ask, well, if you see now with Dr. Bukele in El Salvador is basically moving to an autocracy, not even in the name of creating a socialist revolution, but rather in the name of protecting the corruption that is apparently inherent in the regime that he's introduced. So we have a very difficult, obvious situation politically to deal with, of an oligarchy and of elites that simply will not sacrifice power. And these are people, frankly, that many of us know and work with. These are people that are in the ordinary course of business, middle class, upper class people who speak well, were educated well, and control their countries, but do so in a way that is entirely resistant to fundamental change. But the change itself politically will not be easy. and it is certainly not easy for the United States to talk about thorough, dramatic, ongoing change. We should not look to the State Department to be a revolutionary force in Central America. The State Department is not equipped nor oriented to actually force the kinds of changes that Adriana indicated. You can do so incrementally. You can apply a sanction, but this is not the kind of thoroughgoing, comprehensive reform that's required for societies that are oligarchically controlled and resistant to change over the life of their countries going back into the early 19th century. Secondly, with regard to social order and citizen security, the corruption of the very forces that are intended to protect people in each of the three Northern Triangle countries puts the lie to the idea that these are societies that can protect their citizenry and can operate in a way that is able to function as you would expect governments to do, which is to meet the primary obligation of a government, which is to create a situation of stability and citizen security so that people can carry on their lives. Again, this is not to simply throw out a criticism because it's easy to say. The fact of the matter is it is accurate and it needs to be taken into account when you think about how do we move from where we are to where we'd like to see the situation in terms of the region. And then lastly, and I think one that was not touched upon by my colleagues, is that we have to recognize that if we're not prepared to foment a revolution in Central America, which the State Department and the United States is constitutionally incapable of accomplishing, then how do we see fundamental change? How do we actually start the process if, in fact, my assumption is right that the elites are resistant to change and will not accommodate the kinds of change to the rule of law that Eric and Adriana and Arnau indicate and quite clearly are required. It seems to me that we should look to Mexico as the example of a 40-year transition to democracy that did not take place because it was decided independent of the economic conditions that are required to create a democratic rule of law in the society. Mexico's transition certainly today is not perfect and has not been perfect, but it has created a society that is arguably 50% middle class, or when the economy does not contract, is arguably 50% middle class, measured by any metric in terms of housing, education, fertility rates, longevity, and other metrics. It is a society that is still continues to be plagued by organized crime, a situation that has infiltrated Honduras, to be sure, putting, as I understand, Dr. Baulenas increasingly in El Salvador, and as Adriana knows, has long been a central feature in Guatemala. Mexico still is plagued by citizen insecurity and by horrific transnational criminal organization violence. But the fact of the matter is that it is a functioning political democracy, although we'll see in the election exactly what the electorate chooses to do with the counter-democratic activities that have taken place in the last couple of years. So what is to be done? Let me not end by saying that there's nothing to be done. There's a lot to be done, but we actually, in my view, have to really reorient our policy to working out measures that will lead to the economic changes that could start to have an impact in those societies. And what do I mean by that? We need to have the maquiladoras that started the economic revolution in Mexico. They actually have to relocate to the south of Mexico, to the Guatemalan border. We need low-cost manufacturing to be supported by government subsidies and incentives to move into these countries to start to create the kind of economic and social foundations that permit the political and rule of law changes that otherwise, I believe, are simply not in order. You know, Dwight Eisenhower had a line that we might take into account as we open up the discussion. When you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. And it seems to me that in this situation, to avoid Adriana's fear that we'll do more of the same in the Biden administration than we did in the Obama administration, although these are entirely well-intentioned programs, that we need to actually come up with a new framework by which we look at change and the possibilities of change in Central America. I suggest that we start to look at Central America as part of the North America that's emerging, with the core countries of Mexico, the United States, and Canada, with the idea of putting together a regional bloc, a continental bloc that has indeed great advantages. 17 to 20% of world trade, 1/3 of the global product, 500 million in population, great hydrocarbon and other non-carbon resources that make energy independence a real probability going forward. Countries that are, at least in the core countries, that are committed to the rule of law, albeit imperfectly implemented in each of them. This North American region provides us with a concept by which we can incorporate Central America, both the Northern Triangle, and it's a longer continental future that we should address and make this something that's attractive in each of the countries. And I agree, frankly, with the view that this cannot rely on the quasi-states that those governments currently are to actually accomplish this, but it has to be multilateral because gunboat diplomacy is over. But in the context of a broader North American approach to problem solving, I believe that progress can be made. This is a challenge that requires a multilateral approach and a very big vision of the continental future that's coming. And I think of North America as encompassing the region from Colombia to the Arctic and from Bermuda to Hawaii. That's the way in which we can start to deal with these issues. I fear, for the reasons my colleagues have outlined so precisely, that if we get tied up in trying to solve each of the problems separately, we will find ourselves not able to start to effect the change that's so desperately required in those countries. I hope, David, that has set the stage for a vigorous debate about how we might go about reshaping US policy in terms of advice to our colleagues who are in the government responsible. And let me end where I began by saying, I don't say that without respect for the people who are in there trying to make this work, but more of the same won't work. And as Congresswoman Torres indicated, we simply cannot go back to incremental programs that will have no impact on the underlying problems that we've identified here this morning and this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. A really excellent discussion overall, and particularly in regards to your remarks on the direction of U.S. policy in the region. First of all, clarifying what are our objectives in terms of addressing U.S. priorities like controlling immigration, advancing commerce, but also the question of whether it is our priority to, or how we plan to go about advancing democracy in neighboring countries, balancing against foreign powers that are also interested in the region, and really figuring out, which of these is the primary objective that should direct U.S. foreign policy in the region, so that we can then identify how to proceed on various fronts. But clearly, there are multiple issues, violence and violent crime perhaps just being a symptom of the unrule of law and the pervasiveness of corruption in the region. Similarly, poverty and economic inequality being a symptom of the lack of democratic governance and the pervasiveness of political inequality. In any event, we have very limited time. We've actually run up against the end of our session, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to look to solve as quickly as they possibly can in 2 or 3 minutes, 2 very enormous problems. First of all, in the Q&A, Deborah Lay and Juan Carlos Zapata both ask questions about corruption. What are the measures that we should take to combat corruption? We've talked a little bit about CICIG. We've talked about other programs. I'd like to just ask you each to give your final take on what is the best move, particularly from a U.S. foreign policy standpoint, that we can make in trying to advance the fight against corruption in this region. And as a second kind of line of inquiry from our Q&A session, Ricardo Johnson Okoyisen asks specifically about what we can do to strengthen civil society. And I would extend his question to think about, how much, how long, and in what kinds of ways, in terms of programs and activities, should the United States be investing in order to develop a sustainable and robust civil society in the region. I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes. We'll start with Eric, go to Arnau, Adriana, and Alan, and then I'm going to ask our gracious host, Richard Kai, to close out the session with some final remarks.
Thank you. Since you giving us such a brief time, this won't be a terribly nuanced response. I apologize, but I'll try to be brief. I think in terms of a criteria on corruption, there are many things one could look at, but without a doubt, I think it's the existence of an independent attorney general and an independent court system. I think you can argue quite convincingly that none of the 3 countries now have independent attorneys general or independent court systems. From what Arnau told us in El Salvador, the complete decimation of the independence of the Constitutional Court in Guatemala, and we know the levels of infiltration and capture of the judiciary in Honduras. So to me, that's number one. Now the question is, what do you do about it? That's a tougher question, but to me, that's where you start. What you do about it may be connected to the second question, which is civil society. When we start from the assumption that the state is, let's put it mildly, deeply co-opted and penetrated by vested interests, and they could be organized crime, they could be elites, economic, political elites that are twisting and bending the state towards their interests and not the interest of society in general, then I think our best option, and it's imperfect, is to support the outside independent actors, free media, independent press, independent organizations, it could be the private sector. I don't think this is so shocking. I think this is more or less part of the strategy the US pursued in the Cold War. In Poland, we supported independent unions. We supported independent, thinkers. It's what we have. And so when we have those tools, we need to support them. Is it ideal? No, it's a long-term challenge, but I do think that's the starting point for reversing the capture of the state that we've seen across the board in Central America. There are exceptions. Again, this isn't terribly nuanced, but I do think those independent academic, civil society, private sector, you name it, voices need to be supported as a way to combat the capture of the state.
Gracias.
Let's go right to Arnau. Sorry.
Sorry, David. Gracias. En aras del tiempo, solo dos puntos muy concretos, ¿no? El tema de cómo combatir la corrupción. A veces se ha hablado de estas comisiones internacionales, ¿no? Como la CICIG. Esto es algo que se ha hablado mucho en El Salvador. Y tenemos, de hecho, unas CICIES. ¿Cuál es el problema? El problema principalmente es que las CICIES depende de un acuerdo ejecutivo, no de un acuerdo legislativo, primer punto. El segundo punto es, nos sirve una CICIES que solo puede acompañar, apoyar a la Fiscalía General de la República con algunas investigaciones, pero que no tiene autonomía para litigar los casos de forma independiente ante los tribunales de la República? Mi respuesta sería que no, necesitaríamos una CICIES, ¿verdad?, que fuera autónoma, que no dependiera de la Fiscalía, que pudiera ir enfrente de los tribunales y litigar los casos como un creyente más, y esto no se tiene, ¿no? Porque si no, al final se puede apoyar a la Fiscalía, pero si la Fiscalía está cooptada, al final estamos, yo creo, botando recursos, ¿no? O desaprovechando recursos, desde un punto de vista del combate a la corrupción. Y el segundo punto de la sociedad civil, como miembro, ¿no?, de una organización de la sociedad civil, yo creo que debe articularse, en primer lugar, el trabajo de las propias organizaciones dentro del país. Una vez haya una mayor articulación entre instituciones, ver cómo desde la cooperación internacional se puede apoyar replicando experiencias que han podido funcionar en otros países, ¿verdad? A veces no tenemos que inventar, sino si ya se ha vivido esta misma situación, cuáles han sido experiencias previas, y ayudar en esta implementación, en esta capacitación. Y en tercer lugar, un apoyo constante, y no me refiero tanto a nivel económico, sino también a veces en temas de protección hacia la integridad personal de las personas, ¿no?, que a veces puede estar en riesgo, y ver cómo ante este trabajo que estamos haciendo, si se da alguna circunstancia de ataque ante la vida o la integridad personal, se puede responder. Y termino con el tema de la sociedad o del sector privado. Lamentablemente, lo que hemos podido ver en El Salvador es que los líderes empresariales, ¿no?, empresarios que tienen una gran o que dan mucho trabajo y que están muy arraigados al territorio, lo que están haciendo es procurar por sus intereses egoístas, privados, ¿no?, y acompañando al presidente Bukele en esta deriva, en lugar de decir, bueno, esta no es la vía, esto no es el futuro que queremos para El Salvador. Pero lamentablemente muchas veces el egoísmo, ¿no?, y no la visión de país, no la visión de dignidad humana, nos se acaba imponiendo. Gracias.
Excelente, muchas gracias, Arnau. Adriana, please.
Right. I will try to do it in 2 and 3 minutes. I had written down here independent judiciary, because I think it's no surprise to anybody that works on these issues why the focus and target of these illicit and corrupt networks has been on co-opting the judiciary, because they need it, to ensure impunity for their crimes. And so a focus needs to be there. How you do this is difficult, as Eric mentioned, but there have been efforts by civil society on trying to figure out how do you do oversight of these selection processes, and work that can be there to strengthen those efforts. I do think that tied to that is important, and I'll highlight again that there are efforts or some initiatives, bodies that currently exist that are working. You have, in the case of Guatemala, the FESI, the Special Prosecutorial Body that was created with support of CICIG. You have a similar entity, UFERCO, in Honduras. Again, small, but they continue their efforts to try to tackle these issues under tremendous threat, both internal and external. So I think it's important that the U.S. and other donors continue to provide political support, but also financial support in strengthening their investigative work and trying to strengthen the way, really, of how you tackle kleptocratic structures, because that's what you have in the region. How do you go after structures? There's a lot more collaboration that can happen across borders between these units with the U.S., with investigations that the U.S. and DOJ have here that implicate members of these structures. I think also more effort needs to be given to other oversight bodies, because it's true that they've also tried to co-opt those processes and put people to their liking in these key positions to ensure, again, impunity for their actions. And that includes, the political system and the need to refocus, I think, efforts. And this is tricky on how do you build or strengthen credible, effective electoral bodies, but also figure out how do we diminish the amount of dirty money that is reaching political campaigns and financing many of these corrupt officials. I agree, and I don't want to repeat the focus on strengthening civil society. And again, here I mentioned these laws and attempts to silence civil society, because I think this is an issue that I hope the Vice President and the administration prioritizes, given that it will, if they pass and they implement it, it will limit the ability of civil society to serve that oversight role. And lastly, I want to mention the private sector without throwing all of them in the same boat, because there are variants, there's new initiatives forming, but I do think it's important to recognize, at least in the case of Guatemala, that there are members of the private sector that have financed, benefited, and participated from these corrupt actions. And so I think it's important that the US and other donors in their efforts also tackle these issues. And that means who we partner with, and not, show a contradictory stance in terms of talking about anti-corruption while we may partner with individuals from the private sector that have benefited or participated in corruption. Also includes how we handle loans, the role of the IFIs to ensure that there's mechanism in place so that loans and money is not flowing to entities that have engaged or benefited from corruption.
David, in light of my presentation, I can be very brief. I don't think it's realistic to expect any of those three countries to be able to develop an independent judiciary in the short term or the midterm. This is not a situation that can be dealt with by expecting something to grow in a soil that's completely unsuited to it. So from my perspective, in the short term, the only answer to dealing with the corruption issue is to have transnational judicial institutions like CICIG, but not based in each of the countries, that would have a North American support base that could not be eliminated in any of the three countries. Otherwise, we're going to be repeating the same series of experiences that we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years, and good intentions simply will not substitute for direct authority exercised by transnational authorities. And what the U.S. can do is actually condition its aid and support on those institutions being able to operate in each of the three countries. Over time, we can move to something more ambitious, but in the short term, it's simply not going to happen that you will have the people who control those countries being subject to prosecution and being willing to give up the impunity that they invariably organize in the institutions of their countries. So let me end there. I do think it's doable, though, if you tie this problem to a broader continental future for the region as a whole.
Thanks so much, Alan. Thank you, Adriana, Arnau, Eric. I want to also quickly thank Carlos Fernandez, our interpreter, and Tanya Miranda for their support. And lastly, recognize and give thanks to our host, Richard Kai, the president of the Institute of the Americas.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Adriana, Alan, Eric, and Arnau. It was a very rich discussion. I think we learned a lot about the challenges of governance, rule of law, corruption in the region, in the Northern Triangle. And so I thank you for those thoughts, and there are a lot to reflect on today. I want to mention that tomorrow we're going to turn to the issue of economic opportunity. We've got three excellent panel discussions, one focused on COVID impacts and the regional economic outlook, with representatives from the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, and Fundesa. We've got a panel on the business climate in the Northern Triangle with the presidents of the three American Chambers of Commerce representing Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And Then we have a panel on discuss the issue of direct foreign assistance and the role that philanthropy and impact investing will have in affecting social change in the region. We're going to close tomorrow with a panel with two congressional representatives from the border region of San Diego, Congressman Juan Vargas and Congressman Scott Peters. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow. We have a lot to go through, a lot of issues that, as you can see, the Northern Triangle is grappling with, but there's also economic promise. I also want to mention that many of the US companies that are in the region, they are subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, and companies that are in the that are US that are operating in the Northern Triangle really adhere to the highest ethical standards. And so tomorrow will be an interesting debate about some of these issues of corruption that I imagine will come up. So I hope that all of you will join us tomorrow, and thank you for your participation today. Thank you, David.
Thank you, everyone, and apologies to there were a handful of questions that we did not get to, but the discussion continues tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Ciao.